Welcome to the 5th birthday video for version 5 of the CB&Q in Wyoming. I'm Mark Pruitt. The layout has been under construction for half a decade now. Staging is fully operational and work continues on both the Cody branch and the CNW extension into Lander. The layout underwent a time shift from the period of 1930 to 1945 to 1940 to 1955, and a few early diesels have been added to the roster. Benchwork is now all but finished on the layout. Operating sessions continue to happen 3 times per year. Let's take a look at the past year. First, I'll recap where we were at each anniversary since the layout began. On June 25, 2020, I began layout construction. I started by digging the benchwork for Casper out of storage. Here, the Casper L girders have been reassembled and the legs are being modified and detached. By June 25th of 2021, Casper Yard was functional again. I'd incorporated most of the necessary changes for the new layout, and I'd installed the Skyboard along the walls. The CNW line above Casper was mostly built, with final scenery on that shelf about to begin. Casper was still on casters, so I could roll it out of the way while working on the line above. By the 2nd birthday, June of 2022, Casper was permanently installed against the walls and significant progress had been made extending the line west out of Casper to Powder River, the Wind River Canyon, and Thermopolis. The basic scenery shell of the canyon was also beginning to take form. The main line had been punched through almost to Worland, and the CNW line had extended all the way through Showbone to Riverton and on to Hudson. By the layout's 3rd birthday, some detailed scenery in Casper was almost complete, though there was a lot to go. Powder River stock pens were set in place, and the scenery shell in the Wind River Canyon was progressing at an agonizingly slow pace. The Burlington main line had pushed through Worland and Basin into Grable. Some of the trackage leading to the Cody branch on the lower level of the layout was in place. The Lander benchwork above Grable was built, and Paposia Mine Spur just outside of Hudson, a late addition to the track plan, was built. On the 4th birthday, the staging yard was nearly complete, though the control panel for it was barely begun. Additional rock castings had been placed on the south end of the Wind River Canyon, though progress continued at a glacial pace. Spoiler, it stayed that way throughout this year too. Scenery work on Powder River had progressed pretty well that year though. Track laying was started in Powell, but it hadn't gotten very far. On the layout's 4th birthday, I had an operating session, a great way to celebrate the date. Immediately after that operating session, construction in the 5th year began with the extension of the Skyboard from Thermopolis around behind Holly Sugar. During the rest of the summer and into fall, it was extended behind Worland and, with my friend Dave's help in August, wrapped around into the east end of Basin. In July, I finally began work in earnest on the staging yard control panel. First leads were added to the myriad LEDs and switches that went into the panel. After about 10 days of work, the components and wiring were all in place on the back side of the panel face. Then all the cables that run from the yard to the panel had to be installed. At the end of July, I began that task by hanging the cables to the edge of the yard and tying the individual wires to their connections on the terminal strips. This was a big job and I handled it in small chunks, testing it all as I went. By August 1st, the route selection switches were tied to the tortoises and the indicator LEDs, the blue ones, were functional. The east staging set of occupancy detectors were also functional, mostly. I had miswired 2 of them and blown out the LEDs. They would be replaced later. By the second half of August, the panel was basically complete and the staging yard was fully functional. It became apparent very quickly that the west end of the staging yard, the one you couldn't see at all buried in the corner under East Casper, needed something more than just the occupancy detector LEDs to show you where the end of the trains were. The LED showed if a train was on the tracks there, but they didn't show if the train was clear of the turnouts, so I began experimenting with automotive backup camera kits to show the yard throat. By the end of August, I settled on a kit with a usable monitor size and installed it. In mid-September, I added a second monitor, the one on the right, to show the area at the center of the staging yard over the center set of occupancy detectors. The east yard throat doesn't need a camera, as the yard operator can just turn his head to see that yard throat. After more than a year of work, the staging yard was now fully finished. Also in August, I began adding a turntable to Thermopolis. The prototype town never had a turntable. In the days of steam, the trains would apparently continue on to Bonneville at the south end of Wind River Canyon, where they would be exchanged for a fresh loco for the run back to Grable. Since I don't have Bonneville on the layout, and I didn't want the trains running all the way to Casper, I opted to be able to turn the locos in Thermopolis. By late August, the turntable was in, and a month later, the control was mounted after the fascia was installed. September saw the installation of the fascia at Thermopolis and painting of all the fascia that runs from the canyon all the way around past Thermopolis. In late September and early October, I painted first the track in Thermopolis, then the Skyboard. In mid-October, I modified the timber tunnel portal at the west end of Black Tunnel into its final configuration. On October 22nd, I hosted an operating session for which I got no pictures. After the session, I got to work on Powell again. Here I'm installing a ramp for the first Powell siding to connect it to the west switch. It takes about 20 minutes to build up these ramps using 1/4-inch masking tape, but it provides that very prototypical look of a siding that's slightly lower than the adjacent mainline. In early November, the siding itself went in. Following that, I extended the Powell subroad bed past the west end of town. Then I left Powell alone again for a while. The second week of November, I began extending the ballast on the mainline from Casper westbound. I had done the first part of the mainline way back in May of 2021 when I was ballasting Casper Yard. I hadn't touched it since. In late October of 2024, I stained that ballast I'd laid over 3 years earlier. The first half of November, I pushed the ballast past the Casper engine terminal and into the prairie towards Powder River. The change from white to brownish ballast is the Casper yard limit. Then I went back and stained the new white ballast in Casper to a dark gray. In the second half of the month, I pushed the ballast to within a few inches of the Powder River switch. Thanksgiving week took me back to the Cody branch, where I extended the subroad bed out of Powell to the west. In early December, I laid the main line completely through Powell and onto the new subroad bed west of town. By December 9th, Powell looked like this. The first siding was in, the one nearest the camera, and I was ready to install the remaining 2. That would require more track though, and I was out of code 55. I ordered some track from Iron Planet Hobbies, but they sent me N-scale track by mistake. It went back and they shipped me the correct HO track, but that wouldn't arrive before the new year, so progress in Powell stopped for the remainder of 2024. The new track finally arrived in mid-January. By January 21st, the 2 remaining sidings had been laid and wiring in Powell was complete. In early February, I began messing with a derailment problem at the main switch off the main line in Casper. Most locomotives handled the area just fine, but the big 210-2 Santa Fe's derailed every time. That long wheelbase on the curve let the lead driver ride up and over the outside rail. It took many hours of investigation and analysis. These videos were invaluable in finding the cause. Finally, I made an adjustment to the track, and the problem was solved. Even the Santa Fe's make it without dropping a wheel on the ground. So what was the solution? I added a 20 thou shim under the outside rail of the curve just past the end of the switch. In a few more months, I'll trim the shim to the end of the ties and reballast the area. The second half of February, I began working on Powder River scenery again. The base layer I'd put between the siding and mainline here was curling up at the edges, so I scraped almost all of it off. I cleaned up the mess and left it at that for about a month. I got back to Powder River just after the middle of March and began putting layer after layer of tile grout in place to embed the siding into the ground. I also added a base layer of tile grout to the area just west of Powder River, heading partway around the curve towards Showbon. We'll leave it here for now and come back to Powder River in a few minutes. During that month between bouts of work at Powder River, I installed the crown, cork, and seal siding in Worland. It will go in this open space here. Once I had the basic sub-road bed for the siding and plant in very late February, I began laying out the center line of the siding itself. I didn't like the way it was looking, so I went back and added another piece of sub-road bed. When it was all said and done, I laid out 2 different routes for the siding. After looking at it and planning placement of the plant itself, I laid the siding along the curve closer to the backdrop. That's the last bit of track to be laid in Worland. After I finished with the crown, cork, and seal siding, I turned my attention to the Lander benchwork. It was the same width as Grable, which made it difficult to see the back tracks there. I narrowed a section of the Lander benchwork a bit and clamped styrene to the front edges to represent the fascia. I also added cardboard to the top so you couldn't just look through the Lander benchwork down at Grable. I would make further adjustments after getting comments from the upcoming operating session. That operating session was scheduled for March 25th, but a disagreement with a ladder the week before left me laid up and unable to prepare for it, so I postponed it until the middle of April. My friend Steve from Evanston, Wyoming already had hotel reservations in Casper that were not refundable, so he came up anyway and helped me a bit on the layout. He brought along some 4-foot LED lights he'd bought for a very reasonable price. We installed a couple of them over Douglas to try them out. The lights are 4,000 Kelvin temperature, the same as my room lights and the lights over the adjacent corner in Casper. They lit up the area really well. Sure shows how much work I have to do here, doesn't it? I decided to order more for other areas where the upper deck cast shadows on the lower deck. The LED lights I ordered arrived in early April, so I installed them over Powder River and Grable. They sure make a difference. I had the delayed operating session on April 15th. I was not surprised that it was lightly attended. That 3-week delay meant several people, including Dave and Steve, had other plans and could not attend. It also meant I was actually able to run a train for once. With input from the operators at the session, I modified the width of the Lander benchwork again. By the time I was done, Lander was narrowed about 6 inches, the most I could go without seriously impacting the track plan. The only part I didn't do at this time was the diagonal section at the far end. That would come later. The end of April into early May, I began adding power switches to the turntable tracks at Casper. Up to this time, all the tracks were powered all the time. With a bunch of sound-equipped locos in the Roundhouse, it could get pretty loud around there. Mounting the switches around the turntable controller was easy, and thanks to the wiring being near the front edge of the layout, tying them into the existing feeders wasn't too much of a chore either. After all the wiring was done, I bundled the wires up as best I could. That very old Varney power pack, by the way, is the power source for the turntable. The last step was to paint switch handles for the garden tracks, the tracks off the turntable outside, green. They provide a bit of a guide for which switch controls which track. If my operators prove to be challenged at counting switches and roundhouse stalls, I'll probably resort to adding a small LED over the door of each stall track so the operator can see which tracks are powered. Now we're back to Powder River again. On May 10th, I began adding grass and weeds to the area I'd replaced between the siding and the main line. Then I began adding black washes and chalks to the siding to represent drippings from rail car equipment. The Burlington stored cars on this siding in the off-season, so over the years the siding got pretty grimy with oil and grease droppings. I worked on the siding a few minutes here and there between other things, and by a couple days ago it looked like this. Still a bit more work to do, including maybe a bit more grasses and such along the ballast edge, but it's not looking too bad. Then, of course, the mainline itself has to be ballasted. In mid-May, Steve came up again to spend a few days helping with the layout. We spent most of the time working on Lander. First, we adjusted that diagonal section to meet with the new narrower benchwork rather than leaving the step that had been there. Then we cut and laid the Lander sub-road bed on the benchwork. Early the next morning, we added the risers for the new sub-road bed. Dave arrived mid-morning and we got to work doing final trimming and installation of the sub-road bed. Dave and Steve worked while I mostly watched and took videos. I had to leave for a doctor's appointment early in the afternoon, but by the time I got home, Steve and Dave had the cork laid on the new Lander sub-road bed. What a team! Dave went home that afternoon, but Steve was here for one more day. That next day, we built and installed the first section of the new Cody benchwork under the Thermopolis/Wind River Canyon Peninsula. With Steve and Dave helping out, we accomplished in 3 days what it would have taken me nearly a month to do alone. I'm indebted to them for their assistance. After Steve left, I pressed on through the end of May installing more of the Cody benchwork. This section, next to the furnace, was by far the hardest to install because I only had access to it from one side. This work was a real pain. At 25 it wouldn't have been too bad, but I'm not 25 anymore, several times over. The next few sections were easy in comparison. At this point, I only have one more benchwork section to complete, and that will be the end of benchwork building for the entire layout. Then it was time for sub-road bed under Thermopolis. Because the area by the furnace was so difficult to get to, I did some of the work on a table and installed it later. I assembled a couple of sections of sub-road bed, added the cork, and then the track that will run alongside the furnace. Then I moved that section into place and tied it in with the sub-road bed leading from Powell. I didn't get any shots of installing the risers for this bit. I thought I did, but I guess not. I only had 2 lengths of Code 70 flex track on hand, so I installed those from the end of track near Powell and ordered more. Installing all that benchwork under the peninsula meant I had to find a new place to put all the shelves that had been there. I trimmed the extra length off several of the threaded rods that support the staging yard under Casper and began moving shelves under there. I have quite a bit more of that to do. This past week, I trimmed back the benchwork and sub-road bed on the approach to the Passia River in preparation for laying track into Lander. I also moved one of the legs under Thermopolis so there won't be an obstruction at vocation. In between all this layout work, I added 25 new pieces of rolling stock to the layout. These are just a few. I also added 6 new locomotives. Again, this isn't all of them. A few of these engines needed modifications to add decoders. Others needed renumbering to eliminate duplicates. I also redecaled both of the Milwaukee locomotives I got before the last layout birthday and replaced the decoder in one of them. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the layout through its 5th year of development and operation. What will year 6 bring? More construction, of course. I hope to push the end of track into both Cody and Lander, though track work in those areas won't be complete before the end of year 6, I'm sure. I also hope to move the scenery farther west from Powder River right into the Wind River Canyon. And the layout is in dire need of more structures. Adding several is in the plan. Then there will be operating sessions. If you're going to be in Casper, Wyoming in late October, March, or June, let me know. You'll be more than welcome to join me to run some trains. No experience necessary. Thanks for joining me on this review of the 5th year of the layout. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to tune in for the usual monthly updates, plus a few other videos from time to time as well. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay happy, and enjoy model railroading. See you soon.